Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We shall be commencing in a few minutes. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and Goa University, I welcome all of you to session 3 of the 5th India Forum on China at Goa. This session is titled The Party's Global Interests. Joining us as chair is Professor Varun Sahni, Professor, Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Today we have again with us a series of discussions, of papers, and an exceptionally eminent panel. The speakers include Dr. Gudrun Wacker, Senior Fellow, Asia Division, German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Berlin. The title of her paper is External Challenges to CPC Legitimacy. Followed by Dr. Wacker, we have Dr. Rajiv Ranjan, Associate Professor, College of Liberal Arts, Shanghai University, and Adjunct Fellow, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. The title of his paper, Ecological Civilization and the Path Towards Carbon Neutrality in China, from Political Slogans and Theoretical Constructs to Global Responsibility. Our last speaker would be Dr. Isaac Kardon, Assistant Professor, Center for Naval Warfare Studies, U.S. Naval War College, Newport. The title of his paper is The People's Liberation Army, Overseas Missions after the 20th Party Congress. Our lead discussant would be one of India's most eminent journalists, Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan, founding editor, The Wire. Professor Sahni, the floor is yours.
Fascinating session. When we think about China, what's happening in China, all of us outside China, one of the sub-questions that we're really asking is, what impact does that have on us? So, in a way, trying to understand China and developments in China is about also in some ways understanding China's external projections. And yet, it seems that, on the whole, the foreign policy dimension isn't all that important when it comes to China itself. I mean, of the 14 points in, Xi Jinping thought, for example, there's only one point which is explicitly about foreign affairs and one on security. And, the others are dealing with a whole range of other issues. And I think to some extent, following particularly, the last party Congress, I think that we're going to have to probably ask ourselves, if this is a new era, indeed, what does this mean? And what are the sorts of explanations we're going to be falling back on? Are we going to be falling back on, cultural, historical explanations, going back to, the Middle Kingdom, or going back to sort of the two centenaries and, trying to look at it that way? Or are we going to be looking at sort of BRI and, trying to figure out what does it mean to build hard infrastructure across vast distances? Is there something imperial here, in some ways almost sort of socio-politically, socio-economically? Or are we looking at explanations now really in the realm of thought and ideology, which I think the last session in some ways was about narrative and thought. And, let's not forget that, the start of the sort of the Sino-Soviet rupture had been the question about who would be leading, the world, socialist camp after the death of Stalin, and today there's no question, if that is now the new direction, a renewed sort of focus on socialism in the longue durée, there's no question about who is the leader there. So, in some ways, therefore, do we now have to fall back on a bunch of explanations that we had perhaps put on the back burner, which are sort of really ideological in nature? We've got some great panelists here to sort of unwrap these issues from a whole bunch of different angles. So I'll first of all turn to Dr. Gudrun Wacker from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, and we'll carry on from there. Gudrun.
Okay, thank you. Because I don't have a presentation, and also my challenge is always whether I'm actually standing above the thing or you don't even see me because I'm not that tall. I will give my presentation from here. But before I start, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the organizers of this conference, the ICS and also Goa University, to inviting me back to Goa. This is my second time, and also to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for facilitating a naval trip for me to India. It's always intellectually very stimulating to be here, but also very challenging. Equally challenging was the topic I was assigned when I was thinking about external challenges to the legitimacy of the Communist Party. I couldn't come up with anything to start with, so I started thinking, what is legitimacy? So I will lead you through my presentation in 3 points. One is indeed what are the sources of legitimacy, and also legitimacy from the perspective of whom. So what is our benchmark? Who is the subject we are talking about here? Secondly, there have been some changes, I think, in the sources of legitimacy, starting from Mao until Xi Jinping. I will go through that very quickly, and finally I will try to address the question that was given to me. There is a German sociologist, Max Weber, and he actually explains that there are 4 sources for legitimacy. One is tradition and history, the second is charisma, the third legality, and the fourth is rationality. Now, I think if you look at the picture here, these are the 3 guys where charisma did play a role. So we always have a mix of legitimacy, of different factors feeding into the legitimacy of Chinese leadership generations and leaders. And I think now, or even under Deng Xiaoping, it started that all 4 factors play a role. Tradition, history, the Communist Party as the party that reinstituted the rightful place of the Chinese people in the world. Charisma only in the case of these 3 guys. Nobody would call Hu Jintao a charismatic leader. Legality, I think the legality was there from the beginning because the communists won the civil war, and in the 1970s, the rest of the world, basically the majority of countries, accepted the rule of the CPC. And if we think of China as a party state, basically the state and the interests of the Communist Party when it comes to external affairs are pretty identical. And the rationality, I think this is where the changes have been. Because under Deng Xiaoping, the rationality became that legitimacy is output-based. So in contrast to a democracy where we hold elections, and so it's input-based, the output, the promise of more wealth, for more prosperity, and for modernizing the Chinese economy, that became the rationality and the promise of the Chinese leaders. And this brings me to Xi Jinping, because I think, but you can challenge me on this, that this is changing now because of all the, first of all, the fact that the Chinese economy is not growing at a fast speed anymore, and of course the whole zero COVID policy, which had a grave impact also on the Chinese economy. Xi Jinping started already a few years ago to talk a lot about struggle. So he's preparing the Chinese people for struggle, and this does not only refer to the domestic development, but also to the adversarial external environment in which China sees itself due to the growing strategic competition with the United States. So if you look at the report at the 20th Party Congress, the word struggle, there are people out there who do the statistics, how often the word struggle was used there, and he uses it quite frequently. So I think we might see a shift again from this output-based legitimacy to a different type of legitimacy, which is defending China's interests worldwide. And this brings me to my third point, and I start with some challenges we traditionally think about when we think of challenging legitimacy, and that's criticism that comes from the outside world and is lobbed at China. Now, I think that in the case of China, we have seen that over the years, and I would say since the early 90s, since Tiananmen, China has become very, very apt in either denying, refuting, or, downright declaring that this mainly Western criticism, for example, of the human rights situation in China is not valid. The argument is not valid, either it's not a human rights issue at all, and more a developmental issue or whatever. So I think they have developed quite a good toolbox to deflect Western criticism and other criticism of the domestic behavior of the Communist Party, which is mainly about human rights, may it be in the labor area or vis-à-vis minorities or religion or whatever. Then there is criticism of the external behavior of China. That's probably where we have seen also a lot of effort at first to replace the Western narrative with or Western criticism with a positive narrative that China is out there to provide global public goods, etc. So I think, again, the criticism from the West does not challenge the legitimacy from the perspective of the Communist Party. And I'm saying from the perspective of the Communist Party because that has to be our benchmark when we talk about in the eyes of whom do we talk about legitimacy. So all the talk about aggressive behavior, expansionism, coercion, debt trap, I think China has an answer. And I think what the West has ignored is that if we, mainly the US, but also the Europeans to a degree, frame what is going on now as the ultimate battle between democracy and autocracy, we're still framing it in a way in East-West terms. And we ignore the North-South dimension of the global discourse. And this shows that the West is still pretty self-centered in a way. So what we see from the Chinese side and what is ignored by the West is that China collects a lot of goodwill in Africa. I mean, not successful in every country to the same degree, but we see that China wields more and more influence at the UN level. Basically, they are now either the number one or the number two in all UN sub-organizations. And they gradually start to change the language on human rights by bringing development in. And I would say that China has, since the global financial crisis, started to propagate its own model, not in the political sense, but as a developmentalist state that can provide other countries with sort of a path to their own development and modernization. And this is not completely without effect on these countries. So there is some support, and we see it when the UN makes a decision on anything. So coming finally to the question, are there any external threats to the legitimacy of the Communist Party? First of all, they are indirect. They come through the domestic challenge. So there are external challenges that then are filtered through the Chinese population. At least this is how I see it. And they have mainly to do with what China defines as its core national interests. And of course, Taiwan, I'm glad that there is a group of representatives from Taiwan in the room, is at the forefront of that, because I think that this has become the core national interest where China and Xi Jinping have made clear that there will be no compromise, and that the unification with Taiwan, or reunification, how they would call it, is an indispensable part of China's grand national rejuvenation. So when Nancy Pelosi, and I give you an example for what I'm talking about, when Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan became public, the social media in China exploded, and a lot of people demanded that the Chinese military shoots her plane down. Now, this is obviously something that the Chinese leadership would not consider, but the response to Nancy Pelosi's visit was pretty big. They did military exercises, they published a new white paper, and the military exercises had a scale, well, they actually de facto blockaded Taiwan for several days without even declaring a blockade. But I think this is a pattern that we know from history, and it starts with the May 4th movement. The Chinese leadership and the Communist Party, they create nationalist sentiments in the population, which then explode when there is an event going on where the people believe that the Chinese leadership should respond in a very massive way. We saw this during the Asian financial crisis with anti-Chinese riots in some Southeast Asian countries, and the Chinese people were not happy. We saw it with anti-Japanese protests. And so I think the Taiwan issue is one where the Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping have painted themselves into a corner where they have to respond or even overreact in a situation, because this is one of the issues where their legitimacy can be challenged if they don't live up to their promises. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
ICS, CAS, and Goa University for warm hospitality here. I'm going to talk on this ecological civilization and path towards carbon neutrality in China. And as Mr. Kanta has remarked in our first session, that everything begins with the slogan. When he said that Xi Jinping started with One Belt, One Road initiative, and then Chiang Kai-shek even doesn't have this talking points. So that happens also with this any slogan, and there's a good book by Cheng Ching Han, Slogan Politics. So this ecological civilizations also started with a slogan, and like other more conceptual, and then the responsibility comes to the academician, the policymaker, to give the more pronounced manifestation of this, the concept that the Chinese leaders are giving to the Chinese people and outside world. It's not working. How to? It's not working. Okay. So my presentation is divided into two parts: ecological civilization and then carbon neutrality, and each goes to, first I'm going to try to give a brief literature review on this, the pronouncement of ecological civilization, and how this Chinese academia is trying to construct a new theory to kind of giving a new norms, because China is also trying to build on the new norms, and when you're trying to create a new norms, you have to first deconstruct the existing norms, and then thereby you have to bring your own norms. And here we see that this ecological civilization is a kind of new norms that China is trying to propagate. And then I would come to the more practical part of this ecological civilization, that is how this carbon neutrality is going to fulfill what China said, beautiful China. Now, during Mao era, this folk song was like very famous, Walala. This Walala is also like pronounced like when Xi Jinping is saying that Chungko Changxi Laila. Now here it says that, I'm not going to read this poem, which was very famous, that it said, let the mountains make way and I am coming. And this happened like when the Mao Zedong came with this man can conquer the nature. Now there is a shift from man can conquer the nature to Tianzhen Hui. And now there is a whole gambit of articles, academic pronouncement that to locate this shift in this Tianzhen Hui as a Taoist, as giving a historical, philosophical moorings, to say that, and this, I think, this is one of the beauty of China, that they try to go back to their history and philosophical tradition to emphasize the point they are trying to make it. And then we see that also we have this, how this, the whole gambit of ecological civilization has taken a kind of whole academia, at a kind of like everyone is working on ecological civilization. And we see that this, if you, I did a preliminary search on CNKI, which is a database of Chinese articles, and you see that how this, the keyword Shanghai Wenming is like the articles that has been produced in China is mind-blowing how they have, so, and there is also in a school of thought when we see Feng Liwen during the G20 wearing a Manchu dress, and Xi Jinping is wearing a kind of like Western dress. That is a kind of like constructive post-modernism, where you are not throwing the modern, like kind of the total modernity, but you're trying to integrate the world ideas that the constructive post-modern is coined by the Alfred Whitehead. So there is a whole gambit of a scholarship in China that one is trying to give a mooring about that is ecological Marxism, and one is trying to kind of give not to away from this the modernism, but also trying to bring the Chinese a flavor to the debate. So this, there is a Chinese scholar, Cheng Chih-he, who is trying to say that it's not about to throwing away or alienating away from the modernism, but also trying to give the Chinese definition or Chinese way of looking at the concept that we see that as the ecological modernization. So this is and then he say that this Wang He and Fan is saying that this idea of ecological civilization is spoken as a responsibility of Chinese government to future generation and to the natural world. So now it's not only the sustainable development that we keep to what the United Nations is saying, that sustainable development, but here is the whole scholarship that try to bring the discussion on the ecological civilization. Now, if you look at, again, the CNKI, I did the search about the sustainable development, you see that it's peaked during the 1999 when the China adopted and ratified this 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and then it declined. So that you don't see this, the sustainable development, the key word coming into the Chinese discussion, Chinese literature. Now, so this Chinese ecological civilization is not only a discourse, but like Xin Chao is saying that is a practical strategy, and at the same time it's also a Marxist response put forward by the China in the process of promoting its own economic and social practice. So now why they have left the ecological Marxism to choose ecological civilization is because there was a scholar, Zhang Qi, a scholar with the Fujian provincial party government, who says that because the ecological Marxism put the onus on the capitalist mode of production, that is for the economic and environmental disaster. Now, when China has already the socialism system, how China is also responsible for this environmental disaster. So they have to shift from the ecological Marxism to the ecological civilization. Now, and there are like whole scholarship, I will leave this. Now, let me add here how this the internal debate about ecological civilization, how they are constructing the norms when there is no outsider, like getting this word or this concept getting traction outside the China. So here we have in India, we have debate about ecological civilization. And there are scholars like Banna Siba, Balmiki Prasad. They are now trying to propagate this ecological civilizations, but let me warn you, this ecological civilization is not the Chinese concept of ecological civilization, but here is a renewed attempt to put the historical and philosophical traditions where now what G.P. Deshpande writing in 2000 edited by a book by Professor Alka Acharya, Crossing the Bridge, where he says that if you look at the Panch Seal, the five principle of peaceful coexistence, that there was like kind of less articulation by the Indian side that these peaceful Panch Seal is based in the Indian tradition. Instead, we went to say that the principle comes from the UN Charter. So there was a kind of less articulating, putting the whole discussion into our historical, philosophical traditions. Now, I think that era has gone. Now there is a renewed attempt where like a scholar like Banna Siva is saying that regenerating the ecological civilization. That means we are not shying away from that to put this ecological civilization into the Indian traditions. So you have Balmiki Prasad writing in Economic and Political Weekly. It says that this is the Buddhist tradition. And then you have this, like there are a scholar, there are articles that coming, that is a work by the Tagore and the Gandhi. So there are a whole gambit of a scholarship coming up within India that puts the whole discussion. So I would not say that this Chinese concept of ecological civilization has taken traction in India, but instead it's the Indian tradition that is looking at this ecological civilization. Now there is another example of this, how this ecological civilization as a norm getting traction in African countries. And there is just one good article where it says that how the Xinhua newspaper is now writing and reporting from the the African countries about the ecological civilizations. Apart from that, we don't see a lot of ecological civilization, these keywords coming from the Western countries. Whatever they are doing is doing the ecological civilization concept within China. So now you can see that the sustainable development has significantly went down. Kind of like in 2020, we don't have even 50 articles coming up. Now, let me back to another part of my presentation is like how China is trying to move away from the theoretical debate to the practical, that is the carbon neutrality. And we have seen that during this COVID, how Xi Jinping has already announced that China is going to peak this carbon emission by 2030 and then carbon neutrality by 2060. And we have seen even before, I think someone was talking about this, whatever Chinese leader is saying is not new, but it has a continuity. So the whole concept of even ecological civilization originating from the Soviet, and now even this carbon neutrality or emissions, you have this Wen Xiaobo, Li Keqiang, they're talking about the same thing, but only thing is you have now renewed attempt to again continue with this carbon neutrality thing. And this is going to be a huge task for China to achieve, given you have only 40 years time to peak, 10 years time to peak, and then 40 years time to be a carbon neutrality. Now, as we see that there are like Chinese still currently around like 72% of oil, and then China currently imports 45% of its natural gas consumption. So thereby you have to have, like China needs to transform the whole economic from the carbon intensive manufacturing to the more service-based economy to increase the share of electricity and end use of decarbonizations. And achieving this carbon neutrality is going to be a huge task. But we have seen that during this Chinese 40th plan that there is a renewed like kind of emphasis on the whole how to be a carbon neutrality, and now you have China is trying to increase the wind and solar capacity. China is also trying to have this nuclear energy. I'm not going into details. And then you have this, the one thing that is China is trying to have this the carbon capturing technology, and also this afforestation. Now, during the 45-year plan, that is like becomes very, very significant. If China achieves this carbon peak by 20th plan, it will be huge boost to the Chinese to achieve this carbon neutrality. I'm leaving this on. Coming to the challenges, as I said, it is going to take huge amount of investment to shift from manufacturing sector to the service sector, and it's going to have a huge toll on the working class. This work is still in progress. Before COVID, I had like this doing a survey interview with the street vendors within Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Beijing, and where you see that this youtiao, like the Chinese breakfast selling, like people like now, they're asked to move because this is a kind of like based on the coal furnaces. So they are asked to like move away from Shanghai to different part, like local label. So there is a renewed attempt, and then at the same time you see that there are like minorities that they have not been asked, where you have a barbecue. So minorities are not asked, but here the like Han population is being asked to leave the state to give and to make China as a beautiful. Now, what are the challenges ahead? As I said, it's a heavy investment, and at the same time, when the European Union and US picked their carbon in 2006 and 2007, so they still have a kind of like 30 years time to carbon neutralize. And their per capita income was like more than $20,000. US had 47,000 per capita income in dollar. If imagine like in China trying to carbon peak in 2030, and there this per capita income is only 16,000. So what EU and US did in like have to do in 60 years, China need to accomplish within 30 years, and it is a huge task for China, and I think it's going to have a huge burden not only on the economy but also on society, because the society, like the whole gambit of manufacturing sector and their economy need to transform into a carbon, a kind of efficient and green technological, and I think that's why it's going to have a very different. It's not an easy task for China to pronounce that China is going to be a carbon neutral by 2060. But having said that, if you see that it happened with the carbon neutrality goal also, the moment Xi Jinping announced, and then you have the Tsinghua school of thought coming with the whole detailed plan how to achieve this carbon neutrality. So that gives a kind of confidence that with the Chinese technological capability and the resources, China can achieve the carbon neutrality. The second part of this is it also gives a kind of international image, because you are now no longer a just follower of international norms, but you are trying to create a norms, and you have to have shoulder the responsibility. So now China is trying to convey to the world that China is not shying away from shouldering the responsibility, and thereby you have seen that how Xi Jinping had, even there is a tremendous burden on China to move away from to the green technology. Xi Jinping has announced that China is going to create. And the third point that I would like to highlight, and I will end here, is there is an international pressure, and China has to bow for the international pressure. We have seen during Obama and Xi climate negotiation in 2017, and now also that there is international pressure, and that international pressure does works on China not in a very open, but it's a very subtle way, where China do things if there is enough international pressure. And I think this carbon neutrality announcement was one such incident, or I would say that the China has kind of calculated and given their kind of confidence, and also to boost their international image, I think China came up with this carbon neutrality goal. And I would end here.
Thanks so much. Thank you. And now with this,
Delighted to be here. Thanks so much to ICS and CAS and University of Goa for having me. It's really a pleasure to join you here. And I'm aware that it's late in the day and we've had a lot of really interesting and stimulating discussion, and I'll try and be brief and interesting on the subject that I've been tasked to discuss, which is the implications of the 20th Party Congress for the People's Liberation Army, and in particular its missions overseas. And so to get there, I'm going to try and cover 5 points. First, just take a look at the party Congress and some of the readouts that came from it, and try and understand what the broad policy direction is for the PLA. And as our chair noted, there's not a ton of substance on those issues. There's a lot more focus domestically, but there's something there to sink our teeth into. And then second, I'll take a look at some of the personnel, in particular the Central Military Commission, which is the highest party organ representing the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, and trying to understand what those personnel selections tell us about the PLA. Third, I'll look at this independent process going on within the PLA to modernize and to build the force, and in particular to develop some of the capabilities and capacities required to operate overseas. Fourth, I'll take a look at the external environment that's facing the party leadership as well as the PLA, and think about some of the contingencies, and finally just think about some of the practical implications of those, and some of the scenarios, especially in the Indian Ocean region, in which we might expect to see more PLA forces. So the first thing to say on the broad policy direction under the 20th Party Congress is that there's not a whole lot there, frankly, for the PLA, and I'll get into what how the PLA develops its policy and its mission set. But we know from Xi Jinping's work report that they're basically attempting to frame it as a defensive force. And this is nothing new, of course, but from the work report, Xi said that our country does not follow the old road of some countries to achieve modernization through war, colonization, plunder, etc. And then the leading foreign affairs official who has spoken on this, as opposed to any of the Ministry of Defense people, Wang Yi, wrote in the People's Daily after the conference that this path is not a copy of the rise of traditional great powers, nor is it a reprint of a strong country seeking hegemony, but rather the correct path that benefits China and the world. And so, we understand that this is the rhetorical framing in which they want to put it in, but I think it has some implications for the broad policy directions we expect. There's not a lot of appetite in Beijing among the political class for foreign adventures. I don't think that's the main line direction for the PLA. What we do see in the 20th Party work report, as well as in some of the associated documents, is a focus on the center of strategic gravity for China, as it were, which is in the maritime domain in East Asia. Here I'm thinking particularly about Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea. These are the types of contingencies and missions and strategic concerns that occupy central leadership. And so when we start to look across the Indian Ocean or into Europe or the Atlantic, et cetera, I think there's sort of attenuating interest from a political standpoint. I think not a lot of appetite for taking on additional risk. But I'll get into what some of those risks are that the PLA is tasked to manage, and that sort of contains the kernel or the seed of potential future missions for the PLA. So on to the second point on personnel. And as they say, personnel is policy in some ways, and I think it's really important to try and understand something about the backgrounds and the predilections and the relationships of the people on that, in particular on the Central Military Commission. This is the party body in which Xi Jinping acts as chair, and then there are 6 other top military officials, presumably from across the services and across the different functional components. But as I'll get into, that didn't exactly manifest in this current selection. So the first and most notable member is the first CMC vice chair. Xi Jinping himself is the chair. As Bim Suba and others noted, there has been no effort to identify a successor. In the past, we might have seen the next civilian leader as one of the vice chairs on the Central Military Commission. That is what Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao did, but I think it comes as no surprise really to anyone watching this that Xi Jinping is not setting the table for his successor. And so what we see are people who know Xi Jinping well and have a couple characteristics that I think are notable. So this first CMC vice chair is the 72-year-old Zhang Youxia. And he, of course, breaks age norms, but he's notable also for his very obvious commitment and loyalty to Xi Jinping. Their fathers served in the Red Army together and were, by all accounts, actually quite closely associated. And so this really is a personal connection. And Jiang himself, or the younger Jiang rather, who's at 72, I suppose, is no spring chicken, but he is one of a very small number of PLA members or PLA officers who's had any combat experience whatsoever. He fought in the 1979 Vietnam border war, and I believe also in a little skirmish at the Vietnam border in '86. And so that qualification has been noted by many observers. And that's not the same thing as saying the PLA is itching for combat, but when we look at the PLA as and its attempts to become what they call a world-class military, 一流军队, certainly their lack of combat experience in this entire generation, this lack of practical experience in testing out all this joint doctrine and all these nifty capabilities that they've developed. This is something that weighs on PLA leadership, and you have to assume that they're looking for ways to demonstrate some of this capability, which is not to say through war fighting per se, but I think people with combat experience is a notable inclusion in this Central Military Commission. Another interesting factor in this personnel is that it's effectively all PLA Army. And you'll note that I use the acronym there rather than say People's Liberation Army, but it's not coincidental that the PLA is called the Army. The Army has always dominated the organization, but it actually kind of gave up ground a few times over the last few party Congress cycles. This time they gained it back. There is nominally a Navy admiral who's presumably going to be the political commissar, Miao Hua, but he actually came up in the Army, and he became an admiral, I think, only in 2015, and has only been in political work as opposed to operational affairs. And so all the operators, all the people with combat experience, these are Army folks, and that has to do with the political status, ultimately, of the Army within China. Now, I've already stressed the combat experience. I think I don't want to make too much of that other than to say that there's also He Weidong who had sort of no basis to be there. As Bim Suba noted, there were a bunch of people who kind of jumped up from the ranks, and in He Weidong's circumstance, he hadn't even been on the CMC before, but was elevated up to the vice chair, and again, someone with combat experience. And so I think when you look at what kind of direction, what kind of political signals do we see from the 20th Party Congress, it's that there's a very strong emphasis on this combat experience, and it's something that's obviously sorely lacking across the force. One last thing to note about that personnel has to do with sort of the appetite for more confrontation with the U.S. in particular. The man tapped to be, or likely to be, the defense minister, Li Shangfu, is actually under U.S. sanctions, and so would not be able to meet with his nominal counterpart in the United States. And I think that certainly was a known quantity when he was appointed to that role, and I think sort of demonstrates this expectation, as I'll get into, that the external environment is not a particularly welcoming and favorable one, and that the PLA and the broader party state are poised for a more adversarial and combative kind of set of relationships here. Let's just check to make sure I'm not too far over time. So finally, I'll be brief on or rather not finally, next I'll be brief on the next point, which is that the PLA is, of course, a party army, and there is a dual structure to all of their units in which you have a commanding officer and a political commissar, and there certainly is a very big role for political direction, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, particularly when we're thinking about overseas missions, that so much of this depends really on the PLA's own organic development, its ability to actually field capabilities that would be useful in an overseas conflict. And on that note, I think they're pretty far off of having a high-end combat capability to pursue foreign adventures. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the dilemma facing the PLA of not having a lot of fixed installations overseas. The sole base at Djibouti does not make for a very compelling operational platform when you start to think about, well, what would they do in a variety of contingencies? So I think, independent, the point I'd make here is independent of the policy direction, there's this organic process that we need to watch carefully within the PLA. They're not postured for much by way of overseas operations beyond the quote military operations other than war that we've seen them conducting, for example, in counter-piracy space or peacekeeping or humanitarian assistance. This is not to say that those missions will not develop, and I'll get into some of those directions, but there is essentially an independent process going on that's independent of policy in some ways that we should bear in mind. Fourth, the external security environment or strategic environment, I think, is something that did get discussed pretty extensively by the new 20th Party leadership, Party Congress leadership, and that has, in particular, this notion that the period of strategic opportunity that Deng Xiaoping identified sometime in the 1980s, this idea that China was in a world historically opportune moment to pursue economic development, to not worry that much about military conflict or worry that much about threats. That is decisively over from the standpoint of the 20th Party Congress leadership. And I think that's really, really important in terms of thinking about what is the PLA likely to be asked to do? What are the sorts of circumstances in which they may be called upon to be involved in operations overseas? That work report from the 20th Party Congress is worth reading what they had to say instead of saying there was a period of strategic opportunity. And I quote, "Our countries entered a period of development in which strategic opportunities, risks and challenges are concurrent, and uncertainties and unforeseen factors are rising. Various black swan and gray rhino events may occur at any time." The footnote, the gray rhino is sort of the inverse of the black swan. It's these known huge risks that just haven't trampled us yet, so things like demographics and the environment and other financial risk, debt, etc. So going on, "We must therefore be mindful of potential dangers, be prepared to deal with worst case scenarios, and be ready to withstand high winds, choppy waters, and even dangerous storms." And we heard a lot of stuff like this from Wang Yi as well. He wrote about facing unreasonable blackmail and extreme pressure. So sort of strong language and a very deliberate rhetorical move, I suppose, away from this peace and development thesis, this period of strategic opportunity thesis. And in that context, the PLA is being primed for a more adversarial, more conflictual environment in which they're going to be asked to deal with worst case scenarios. And beyond that, even if there aren't these contingencies that require the use of military force, the tasking on them and the expectation in a peacetime scenario to deal with these with this much more unfavorable international environment has to drive a lot of the resourcing for the PLA, drive a lot of its posture, drive a lot of the doctrine that's going to ultimately inform what they do. And I think we're also looking at a period in which the PLA, as a result of other external circumstances in the international environment, specifically COVID, has stood down a lot of what it might have otherwise been doing over the last 2.5 years to, for example, establish more robust overseas operations. And I think we should expect that to get back on the trajectory it was before. So finally, some practical implications and some of the scenarios in which, particularly in the Indian Ocean, I think you'd imagine the PLA having an appetite to do a bit more. And again, back to our sort of core text of that work report from the 20th Party Congress, they talk a lot about the need to closely connect to new strategic opportunities, new strategic tasks, new strategic stages, new strategic requirements, and new strategic environments. This all sounds very strategic, but this all comes in the context of the core mission that the PLA does have overseas. I probably should have highlighted this earlier, but this idea of protecting overseas interests is really the call of the day. That's the real big policy direction. And what that means has been articulated in some of the Ministry of National Defense's writing over time. And that has to do with Chinese citizens, Chinese assets, as well as especially the sea lines of communication that connect them back to China. And so Wang Yi, again, he's the highest level kind of foreign and defense official who has articulated what we should be reading or what the party should understand from this 20th Party work report. Talks specifically about things like the PLA organizing and implementing 19 evacuation operations for overseas citizens to protect the lives of overseas compatriots, providing 24-hour consular protection and emergency hotline, not really a PLA mission. And naturally, Wang Yi is from the Waijiao Xitong. He's not the guy who's going to direct the military in any way, but he's the only one speaking publicly about some of these security issues. So I think we need to pay attention to where he's coming down on this. And he's basically saying that, or rather, I quote him saying, they want to resolutely counter any erroneous acts that infringe on our sovereignty, interfere in our internal affairs. So of course, that's not an external event. But the framing of what those overseas interests are is what's problematic from my standpoint. I think the scope of the mission set that the PLA has expanded along with the footprint of Chinese economic actors overseas. And that, of course, is the leading edge of China's influence and China's interests overseas. And the more I read in the PLA's own doctrinal writing, the more that linkage is reinforced, this idea that the core mission set is protecting China's overseas interests. China's core overseas interests are its economic access and the well-being of its personnel and its assets overseas. And I think that, paired with growing capability over time, kind of creates this recipe for greater appetite for various types of contingencies. And again, the ones we're talking about here, they're obviously construed defensively. It has to do with protecting Chinese economic assets overseas and people, but there are lots of ways in which that kind of slips into potentially more conflictual scenarios. And here I'm thinking about, I would think if there were significant terrorist attacks on Chinese citizens, as we've seen in places like Pakistan especially, the PLA is increasingly well postured to deal with things like that. And I think if that were to happen, and if we were to see an outcry in the mainland about, we've been modernizing our military and becoming strong all these years, and yet we're still vulnerable to these low-level threats. Why aren't we doing anything about it? And I think those are the types of apertures through which the PLA is probably going to continue to expand its mission set. And just as a final point, I think the domain in which that's most likely, or rather the theater, continues to be the Indian Ocean region, and precisely because it is the locus of China's economic interests in some fundamental way, or at least those interests that they can reasonably protect with military force. Of course, Europe is China's biggest trading partner. America is a source of major technology. There are economic interests that are very widely distributed. And of course, the developing world, and particularly in Africa and Latin America, are huge sources of resources and big export markets in their own right. But ultimately, the Indian Ocean is the theater through which all of this trade is going to flow, unless and until the Arctic sea lanes are open year-round. This is what China relies upon to keep its economic engine going, to sustain any type of military conflict. And so when the PLA looks at the globe, they see the Pacific as the war-fighting theater. As I mentioned, Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, these are the conflicts that are conceivable for the PLA. But the strategic rear remains the Indian Ocean. I think that's an area we're not seeing the PLA try to develop high-end combat capability, at least not yet, but I think it's also the most likely theater in which they're going to face these kind of smaller acute threats that are going to draw them out of their reticence and perhaps provide exactly those sort of small-scale, limited conflicts that are going to be necessary for the PLA to develop some confidence that it can operate jointly, that it can use all this fancy new gear, and that it can fulfill the parties' directives to protect overseas interests. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much.
And again, thanks to ICS, CAS, and Goa University for inviting me to be part of this. It's a challenge to summarize or to offer coherent comments to 3 papers, but my task has been made somewhat easier by the fact that each of these papers have actually dealt with a different aspect of what the organizers have called the global interests of the CPC. If Professor Wacker's paper has focused on a kind of defensive, China's broad defensive strategy in withstanding pressures, challenges from overseas. Professor Rajiv Ranjan has looked at another equally important facet of the CPC's global interest, which is the use of, he doesn't use the phrase, but the use of soft power. In this instance, through the articulation of a environmental friendly development path that China promotes and hopes to present as some kind of a model for the rest of the world. And I'll speak a little bit more about that again in a bit. And of course, Dr. Isaac Kardon's paper looks at an equally important facet of the CPC's global interest, which is the projection of hard power. So we have China coming up with a defensive strategy in the face of what it perceives as Western pressure on its core interests. And then we have China's use of soft power as a means of winning friends and influencing people around the world, and then China's use of hard power to, of course, defend its core interests, but also in terms of, it leaves open the question of how that hard power might be used. And all hard power, when it is developed, is always framed through the prism of defensiveness. But of course, hard power is hard because it has that dual capability. And I would like to just spend a couple of minutes dealing with each of these aspects that these papers focus on. Professor Wacker talked us through the changing sources of legitimacy for the CPC. And I think she's absolutely right. I love the elegant phrasing of the Chinese model as being, model of legitimacy as being driven, as being output generated as opposed to input generated. And clearly the ability of the Chinese leadership to deliver on all the promised outputs is what allows it to maintain the social contract that it has enforced over the last 70 years, 75 years. And if slowing growth rates and its rather odd response to COVID, which has essentially ensured that China has kicked the can down the road where the rest of the world is done and dusted with its peaks, China is still looking at the possibility of peak COVID hitting it maybe in a year or two, and is petrified by the prospect. And we've seen the kind of volatile situation. If you've turned on the news today, public protests in Shanghai about the death of people in Urumqi. At one level, if you're a lover of democracy, how wonderful is that? But it probably sends a shiver down the spines of Xi and his colleagues. at how such a thing is possible and how mishandling has brought the party and the government to this sort of a situation. I think Professor Wacker is right in focusing on Taiwan as the potential flashpoint. Here, though, I would just perhaps draw a slightly different conclusion from her about or maybe she didn't mean it in the way that, I don't think there's an actual danger of the Chinese leadership I think they know how to play the game of calibrating public opinion and harnessing public opinion in China as a key legitimator for foreign policy decisions, military decisions that the party and the government take. But I was reading a paper just the other day, US Naval War College paper on 8 or 9 case studies where the Chinese have been involved, the Chinese PLA at different levels has been involved in relatively minor military confrontations with its neighbors. And this is a study which covers the period from 2009 to 2014. And this paper looks at and tests the hypothesis that is public opinion driving militarism and military outcomes, or is it the other way around? And the conclusion is that there is a gray area, but by and large, the party is pretty much in control over the narrative. So I think even in the case of Taiwan, very well played, well calibrated, high risk. But I don't think anybody seriously in Washington doubted that post Nancy Pelosi's, I believe, adventurous visit, unnecessary, provocative visit, nobody, I don't think seriously believed that there was a real danger of conflict erupting. But the Chinese were able to present that and play that game very well. And I think that we will probably continue to see the Chinese playing that kind of game. But a lot depends on because this is still, I would put this in the realm of China's defensive grand strategy. How do you deal with the situation where the US, Australia, Japan, India, other countries are creating structures, Quad, for example, in your region, that you see as a direct challenge. And no matter how much the 4 nations play down the military aspects of the Quad, it is clear that there is a military dimension to it. And so, how the US plays the game, I know there is a debate. Very good article in the recent issue of Foreign Affairs by a scholar I wasn't aware of earlier called Ali Wayne, where he makes a very persuasive case for the Biden administration to not get locked into looking at China as a peer competitor that you have to compete and construct your entire foreign policy around, but to find some kind of a via media where you engage and you compete, but not in a kind of black and white way. So I think a lot of the CPC's global interests as far as the defensive game goes will depend on how the US and other powers also play the game. Rajiv Ranjan's paper I found fascinating because there's very little discussion about China's broad environmental policies. In the public mind, people focus on those images from 10, 15 years ago of China as a horrendously polluting country, which of course it is in various aspects still. But the fact is that beginning from the 2010s onwards, and I would say even the ecological civilization project is hard to separate from Xi Jinping's 4 revolutions and 1 cooperation, this idea on energy that he promoted beginning from the 19th Congress. This idea that you have to have a revolution in energy consumption, a revolution in energy supply, a revolution in energy management, a revolution in energy technology. And it's interesting to see how the seeds of carbon neutrality by 2060 are actually laid down in a systematic way. And this is where perhaps we in India need to learn from the Chinese. There is hardly any grand declaration. I think Li Keqiang carbon neutrality announcement was made last year, was it, or 2 years ago? And it's done when you have 8 years of systematically working on the 4 revolutions and 1 cooperation idea on the energy security front, where you consciously are working towards rationalizing energy consumption, shifting your balance away from carbon towards greater reliance on nuclear, on wind, on solar, and then working on scientific grid management, working on developing scientific, well-functioning energy markets. And all of these are seen as necessary constituents for that idea of one cooperation, which is cooperating with the rest of the world on trying to evolve the best energy security strategy for the future. And I think that the ability of the Chinese, of course, I think there's a lot of marketing and packaging that goes into this. Even in India, we love to trace the history of our supposed environmental concern all the way back to the Vedas. We now speak of ourselves as the mother of democracy. So the lineage of democracy has been traced back to the Vedas. So the Chinese do this too. And there is, of course, a contradiction, because the more you hard sell a concept like ecological civilization as being the product of a Chinese way of thinking, also in a way reduces its saleability as a global concept. And I think that the Chinese would very much like to get into the game of pushing for global ideas and global norms. You just have to look at COP27, the outcome where the Chinese actually, and this again reflects something that Professor Wacker said about the Chinese support in the rest of the world on key issues, and the fact that there is a North-South dimension, which still is very, very important at the global level. And so if you look at COP27, the battles that were waged between the developed world and G77 plus China, representing the developing world, it's the latter that finally emerged somewhat victorious with the new fund, the loss and damage fund. There is an ambiguity as to whether China will contribute or not. China may very well end up contributing on a voluntary basis, but the idea that it's the developed countries that have to do the heavy lifting on that front was cemented at COP27. I think that's a major accomplishment and tells you something about China's ability to be part of global coalitions and to actually not allow the US and its allies to divide the world along lines of their choosing. So I think the Chinese soft power, I'm not sure how much traction ecological civilization has as a concept, but certainly the Chinese ability to present themselves as being on the right side of climate change, has a lot of takers globally. Turning to the last paper on Chinese hard power, I think it's a very, very sobering note to end this panel on, because the fact is that the Chinese have decisively turned their back on the earlier strategy of ducking or hiding, and have been doing so for some time, even prior to the 20th Congress. I think that sitting here in India, it's impossible to reflect on China's military strategy without taking into account the provocative activities that are happening on the India-China boundary, in particular in Ladakh, the attempted ingresses made, and the clash in Galwan. There is a sense in which the PLA, in a politically driven manner, of course you have theories that India-China often accidentally end up into situations that they can't control, but there is a method in this madness, and that's why it's dragged on for so long. And I think that the tea leaves from the 20th Congress, the emphasis that Xi Jinping made on choppy waters and coming storms, these are all ominous signs. I think that in India sometimes we tend to focus a little bit too much on the maritime domain, the Chinese threat in the Indian Ocean. The way I see it, and I think I agree with Isaac Kardon here, that the threatening capabilities of the Chinese are still a long way in the making. Of course, elements of this are there. The Type 52s, the Type 55 destroyers that are on the way. There was a recent study I saw that the Chinese have the capability, even though they at any given time deploy, say, 3 to 4 warships in the Indian Ocean region, mainly in terms of anti-piracy operations. But the Chinese, even given current PLAN strength, have the ability to deploy anywhere from 15 to 18 warships on a continuous basis in the Indian Ocean region, should they choose to do so. Of course, a lot of this is linked to the Chinese need to protect their SLOCs and the sheer volume of trade, energy trade that transits through choke points in the Indian Ocean region, all the way from the Red Sea up to Straits of Malacca, necessitates that kind of Chinese strategy. But I do feel that the focus on, and it shouldn't surprise us. And I'll end with this last point that, the fact is that, the Chinese, the bulk of their conflicts so far have been, all of their conflicts, in fact, have been in their border regions. And that provides cold comfort to a country like India, which has thousands of kilometers of an unsettled boundary, and one that we need to work out on the basis of, dialogue and discussion, and there are agreements. But the fact of the matter is that this unsettled boundary and the repeated assertions by Xi Jinping in the 20th Congress and at other fora about the need for protecting Chinese sovereignty, Chinese internal, internal affairs, etc., which are all code words for Indian territory, which is coveted by China or currently occupied by China. All of this is a wake-up call for us in India. I do feel that a lot of the military challenges are, while it's important to read the tea leaves from the Congress, and I think the focus on, I think it's interesting what you said about the combat experience of the folks in the CMC, the top-notch. All of these are pointers to the fact that the PLA and all its associated branches want to flex the muscles. But the fact is that the Chinese are also well advanced in terms of the revolution in military affairs and their use of cyber, their use of AI, their use of robotics. And I think that for the rest of the world to respond in a conventional military manner to the emerging Chinese military threat, there may be some mistake in ignoring what's happening at the cutting edge, where the Chinese and the US are pretty much key players there, and an army military like the Indian one is really quite far behind. So I think that I'll end there, but just again, 3 marvelous papers that looked at different aspects of the CPC's global interests and really provided a lot of food for thought for us. Thank you very much.
And thanks a lot for that, Siddharth. I think, I'm conscious of the fact that we do have to open this up to the audience. We have, we started half an hour late. So, at some stage we're going to have to sort of open up, but I would still like to give each of the panelists at least a couple of minutes to maybe take on board some of the points that Siddharth has presented. Okay. Sorry, I was mumbling, I suppose, for all of you. I just said that before we open it up to all of us to sort of interact, probably a couple of minutes each to the panelists if there's something that Siddharth has said that you'd particularly like to take on. And maybe, Gudrun, would you like to?
Okay, thank you. I'll start with the statement that Isaac made, because it made me think whether this would also be sort of an external challenge to the legitimacy, and that's if the Chinese leadership and the PLA fail to protect Chinese lives and assets abroad. And I think this example shows that domestic and external, it gets more and more blurred. What is domestic, and also, and this brings me to the comment, I think what we see under Xi Jinping in a very systematic way, that security, and security in the sense what Xi Jinping defines as a security issue, has the absolute predominance. This is the dominant issue, and he's willing to sacrifice a few $1 trillion, in one stroke, if he thinks that security is threatened at a point. And therefore, I think the fact that I believe the social contract that has existed since Deng Xiaoping we will modernize the country, people will become wealthier. That's not necessarily holding anymore. You have unemployment about young, educated people, etc. And therefore, it might be that this easy calibrating of the nationalist feelings will not work anymore, because once you shift the legitimacy more to we are protecting China's core national interest and base the legitimacy on this argument, then it becomes less easy to sort of instrumentalize nationalism and rein it in if you fail to do so. I think on the South China Sea, etc., they have some wiggle room. You know, they're still working on the code of conduct, etc., etc. But Taiwan is another thing, another issue, because first of all, Xi Jinping has made it indispensable part of his 2049 goals with the national rejuvenation. And there are red lines that the leadership has spelled out very clearly, also spilled. One is, and they exist since the 2005 anti-secession law, and basically this has not changed. Though there are two factors, and these are the red lines: interference of a third country. We all know who the third country is, and also the independence forces in Taiwan. So if you spill out a red line, and then you don't act upon it when the red line is crossed, or what you perceive as crossing, you have a problem in your legitimacy. So it's not only the public response I'm talking about here, but the fact that the leadership and Xi Jinping have painted themselves into a position and into a corner where it's very hard to see how they would calibrate their way out of that if the red line is crossed.
Yeah, I agree with your point that the Chinese terminology is not getting traction outside China, like even the ecological civilizations. But when you remark that we tend to locate any meaningful dialogue or philosophical looking back to the Vedas, I think this is the new trend in India, where we try to look back to our own tradition and history, try to give a kind of underpinning, because I think earlier it was missing, because even I gave an example of this Panchashila. We failed to give this kind of historical and traditional philosophical underpinning of that. Instead, we looked at how the United Nations Charter is looking at, whereas the Chinese had come up with a very, try to locate within this, even this, it's coming from the Buddhism, where it was started in Indonesia. The Chinese kind of grabbed the whole idea and tried to put forward it's a Chinese, kind of terminology. Now, I think why I'm saying this is a new trend in Indian philosophical, or kind of looking back as a kind of not shying away, but looking at a very confident level that, look, we have to underpin this even ecological civilizations. We are not looking at this as a Chinese concept. We are looking at it was there within in our philosophical traditions. Even the Bandhana Siva, I mentioned that it's regenerating. We look at that it's a kind of philosophical, and then we try to also move to the contemporary world, where you have the philosophy of Tagore and then the Gandhis. So I think this is the new trend, that we want to own the concept and terminology in our own sense, rather than looking back to what G.P. Deshpande says, that we have this looking back to the expressing ourselves in English, not in our own languages. And that's why we fall into trap of trying to co-opt the Western philosophy to support our own terminology, even kind of denying that it has our origin in our own history. So I would differ from you here that it's a newfound, I think, interest within Indian academia also. Now we see that there are a lot of scholars coming up with even international relations. Or we think we don't have kind of like this school of international relations. Now there are schools of looking back at the Sankhya and at that Tuvad that to produce that we do have this our own.
The points we made very well. Anything else?
Sure. I would just thank you for calling our attention inland. I think that was a gray rhino that I neglected to corral, and I think of that in the context where I said, you know, what are the really urgent security goals, and that uniquely has this overlap with the really kind of overwhelming focus on security and territorial integrity, and it will not go unnoticed in this room that this is the last PLA use of force. It usually, you know, we usually think of 1979 border war with Vietnam as the last major combat, but of course there was significant loss of life on the border in 2020, and in 2017 in Doklam there was also pretty close to a skirmish as well. And so when we look at the political climate in which the PLA is operating, the pattern of behavior on that long contested border, I think that's pretty high on the list of possible contingencies in which we'd see the PLA try to do somewhat more than it has done in the past.
Great. So questions and comments are welcome. Just please keep them short. And I see the first board up is Jyoti Malhotra, so she has first shot at it. If it's a question, please sort of address it to the panelist. And we'll probably take groups of 3 questions, and that'll make it a bit faster. Please go ahead, Jyoti.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Chair. My question is to Dr. Isaac Kardon. And you somewhat made amends, I think, just now by talking about the Grey Rhino event, the Chinese, the PLA army's ingress or incursion or aggression into to Indian territory across the line of actual control. And I was wondering actually why you didn't mention it before. Perhaps you forgot, it was an oversight. But my question to you is, how do you, or how does your institution, the Naval War College, think, what do you think of it? Why do you think the Chinese, the PLA army, had to cross the line of control? You know, COVID had already begun. It was in April 2020. They continue to hold Indian territory. Even if they believe it's Chinese territory, why is it that they refuse to talk to the Indians about it? So why this aggression? What was the need for it? Thank you.
Dr. Tiwari, yours was the second board I saw. I'm going strictly by the order at which I've seen the boards, please. Don't worry.
Thank you, Chair. My question is first to Professor Wacker. You used the framework of Weberian legitimacy. Let me kind of just sort of flag it off with the fact that Weberian legitimacy may not be sufficiently, it may not be sufficient to evaluate a political regime's claim to legitimacy, in so much as it doesn't refer to the regime itself as much as it seeks to define the sources of citizens' beliefs. And in a way, it superimposes political stability over the original meaning of legitimacy, many a times reducing it to routine submission of, in this case, Chinese people to authority. So between your question, who is the subject, and it was a very fascinating question to put in that sense, who is the subject, and your hypothesis that rather than output-based legitimacy, now what we see is an input-based legitimacy. I kind of see there a gap because the hypothesis focuses on the objective or the goal of legitimacy rather than the subject itself. So your comment on that. A very brief question to Rajiv. Do you think that China's commitment towards green technologies will be the leverage that it needs to create an edge in the global economy and a way to append the international system to its advantage, particularly so as it resonates very well with the larger visions of Global South, a multilateral, responsible international system?
We'll be taking one more question in this round. Dr. Haque, please.
One quick question, primarily to Dr. Wacker, but maybe others also jump in, because we're talking about this output legitimacy. And we have a very nice image of our conference. Mao obviously was successful in creating the People's Republic of China. Deng Xiaoping obviously did the economic rise. You can see that on several numbers. But how about Xi Jinping? So what is the output? So at which stage you can say, this is, now we can be labeled as the world power. So it's, from my perspective, a very abstract thing to say, I'm the world power, I'm the dominant power, or whatever. And what do you think is his practical goal, or is there none? Is it just an image he wants to achieve?
Why don't we take a crack at these questions and then we'll have another round?
Thank you, Dr. Malhotra, for the question. I suppose that, as I said, the omission in part has to do with the fact that from the Chinese perspective and from the PLA perspective, of course, this is not an overseas mission at all. And ultimately, the issue is sovereignty from China's standpoint, and the territory in which they fought, again, from their perspective, is Chinese sovereign territory. That doesn't really change anything. That's just an analytical point. As to the question of why they were there, I think that does take us some significant way towards understanding that, because of how pressurized the security situation is in China, issues bearing on sovereignty and territorial integrity really rate quite highly. And for some of the reasons that I noted about the relative inexperience and lack of operational opportunities, as it were, I think the PLA has a little bit of a lighter, lower threshold on its use of military force in these issues. It's this overlapping set of issues, and from their perspective, it goes back to this language from that 20th Party report about resolutely countering erroneous acts that infringe on our sovereignty. The perception was Indian military was building infrastructure in disputed territory, and they wanted to take a step to check that adverse trend. And I think it's notable that this kind of fits with what we understand about some long-term PLA doctrine that dates back to the early days of the Red Army, in some ways, of a preference for limited use of force to achieve discrete political ends and to check adverse trends. And I think that the thinking in Beijing, to the best I can decipher it, has to do with basically providing a very costly signal to India about how it's likely to play out if they continue to pursue infrastructure development in those disputed regions. I think that's probably the acute cause. But it's worth noting that this is, of course, the only unresolved land boundary that China has. All of its maritime boundaries are unresolved. And I would lump Bhutan in with the India boundary dispute because they're kind of coterminous, especially in Doklam, as we saw. And I don't think that's arbitrary. I don't think it's solely up to China what happens with that. And I would be keen to learn more from my Indian colleagues about the ways that the Indian foreign policy community and defense community thinks about it. But I think from Beijing's perspective at a strategic level, rather than that operational level of checking the development of infrastructure, I think they're periodically looking to demonstrate some type of kind of hierarchical superiority to India in South Asia. And there are a variety of ways in which they pursue it, but I think demonstrations of force periodically are a part of that policy portfolio.
Rajiv, was there a question for you in this round? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Nidhisha. I think partially yes, because we have seen now that China is the now largest producer of clean energy, wind and solar. So that technology can be used by the global south. And now China is coming with the kind of huge investment, and they have created this climate fund. So yes, but given the China-US tension, and I don't think this is feasible, and at the same time, China is also dependent on high-tech green technology on the Western country. So I think yes or no, partially yes and partially no. So China can help, but at the same time, it's also dependent on the West to provide this green technology.
Well, I try, although I don't know whether I have a good answer for you. I think I didn't think about legitimacy. I thought about it mostly from the perspective of the Communist Party itself. And for them, political stability is certainly sort of an indicator. You know, if everything is fine and quiet, then the legitimacy is not challenged, right? Now, we have domestically, we had a lot of times, turbulent times, when people protested. And I think in the previous session, we already talked about there are always carrots and sticks. So the sticks are part of the arsenal. I don't exclude the political control mechanism, and actually I think that this leadership believes that they have found a technological solution to social control. And maybe the whole zero COVID thing is, as a side effect, also a giant experiment in trying to figure out how far this control can go. Because I think the party never had control on this level of society where they actually can control whether somebody can leave the house or not. And we all know, you know, at the village level it was always very difficult. So this is part of the toolbox, so to speak. And this toolbox of carrots and sticks we also see in the external measures that China is taking. I'm not even sure that China wants soft power anymore. I mean, the Taiwanese speak about sharp power because overwhelmingly the stick, the big stick, is predominant in anything that China doesn't like. But coming back to the legitimacy issue, if you look at how Jiang Zemin, for example, co-opted the middle class, and this brought more legitimacy because it also brought more stability, of course, by allowing entrepreneurs to become members of the Communist Party and telling them you are important for the modernization and the progress in China. And Xi Jinping did two things, I believe, that were pretty popular and increased the legitimacy of the party in the eyes of the common people. And that was first the anti-corruption campaign, which killed several birds with one stone, so to speak. And then also, not so long ago, this whole, cracking down on excesses among celebrities, that was also pretty popular, you know, that certain liberties and have gone too far and wealth cannot buy you everything. So the CPC and Xi Jinping demonstrated then that when the stability and the security is at stake, we are willing to crack down, we are willing to make economic sacrifices, and the population has to be prepared for that. So maybe we can talk later, I don't want to dwell on this. On Herrn Haag's question, I mean, it's clear, I think we have never known the ambition of China so clearly. You know, when it was the time of Tao Guangyanghui keeping a low profile, you never knew what China's ambition is. We had some hunches where they want to end up. But with Xi Jinping, you just read his speeches and it's clearly there, and they want to be number one. So the big obstacle in the way is the United States, and this is why this is such a dominating. And on the other side, we have a US that doesn't want to give up technological leadership, supremacy in the Indo-Pacific, etc., etc. And so you have Well, the classical thing between the upcoming power and the existing power. And I think the goals for 2049 is really that China is number one and that it's restored to its former glory in a way, accepted at the international stage, etc. Although they don't care about the West anymore, whether the West praises what China does is not so important anymore. By the way, there is a joke in China that went around shortly. I mean, Xi Jinping was already on the scene, but he had not taken power. And it goes like this: 1949, only socialism can save China. 1979, only capitalism can save China. 1989, only China can save socialism. 2009, only China can save capitalism. And this shows you what a watershed event the global financial crisis was for the thinking of the Chinese leadership. Sorry to be long.
No. The thing is, Goan sunsets are spectacular, particularly on an overcast day. But there are 3 signboards up there. Dr. Shen, I saw, Professor Ravni Thakur, and Dr. Jabin Jacob. And our organizer also wants to ask a question. So, it's now between you and the sunset. So, first of all, please, Dr. Shen, let's keep them really short so that,
Okay. I echo the presentation of Isaac. Actually, in CMC 7 member, there are 2 guys have the combat experience, except Zhang Youxia. Another one is Liu Zhenli. When Liu Zhenli in company level, he joined the war battle in Liangshan, the so-called Liangshan 战役, Liangshan 老山战役, maybe in 1987 or 1988, because China and Vietnam War began in 1979, but continued to 1988. The second is, we'll not forget that He Weidong, he had 2 theater command experience. Except the Eastern Theater Command to be the commander, he also is the army commander of the Western Eastern Command. So Xi Jinping promote this guy because he have 2 experience in East side and West side. West side we know is India in 2017, and that during the Dokran event. Thank you.
Really brilliant papers. I'm going to cut my question short. Professor Wacker actually answered my question on Xi Jinping's steps towards legitimacy. I was going to bring up the anti-corruption campaign. But I will ask Rajiv a short question. Rajiv, you constantly mention the names of non-state actors where India's environment was concerned, but none on the Chinese side. And the Chinese environment movement also actually starts at the NGO and public level. People like Liang Songqie, who was the grandson of Liang Qichao, for example, sets up the Friends of Nature way back in 1994. You had Tang Xiejiang, who ran an NGO and won the Magsaysay Award in 2007. So all of these intellectuals have actually also had, then you had Ma Chun, who is a waterman. So all of these intellectuals have also actually had a great role to play in terms of setting this discourse on China's environment. If you'd comment, otherwise we can discuss it later. I won't take up time from the conference. Thank you very much. Brilliant papers all around.
Yeah, a couple of quick questions to Isaac. On your argument that the PLA army was crowding out the other services from the CMC, so what are the implications then for the leadership of the theater commands? What do you think are the long-term implications of this particular trend? Second, how do you square this trend with the fact that all these new strategic opportunities are likely to be in the maritime environment? So what does that say about China's maritime focus? Thank you.
Firstly, my compliments to all of you on such enlightening papers. My question is to Dr. Isaac Kardon. Sir, when we look at the American military apparatus and take into account their military budget, it becomes difficult to detach from the idea that overseas expeditionary ventures are integral to American foreign policy. Today, we also see China developing a more elaborate overseas operational policy, And you very rightly touched upon China's naval footprint in the Indian Ocean region, in the Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, East China Sea. My question to you, sir, is do we see China's overseas military ventures extending across nations that fall under the BRI in the manner in which in the age-old imperial Chinese tributary order, Chinese forces would often be deployed beyond Chinese borders, most notably in the Korean Peninsula in 1592? Or alternatively, do we see a more expeditionary approach to Chinese overseas military ventures? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think I got a whole bunch of those. So let me try and take them quickly. And for Dr. Shun, I appreciate the clarification. I did refer to the second combat experience, and I believe it was 1986, the continuation of the Vietnam campaign. And that leads into those are both Army guys, and of course that was land combat. Leads into Jeb and Jacob's question about the PLA Army crowding everyone out. In some ways, that's just back to as a reversion to the mean. In some ways, we have seen politically, at least, that the Army has dominated, and I guess I would interpret that in line with the rest of the personnel appointments in the 20th Central Committee, which is to say, your political redness, that's probably now an anachronistic term, your she-ness, your level of obvious political affinity was probably determinative, and I think the Army positions itself better. As to how that plays out for the theater commands, perhaps Dr. Shun is a better one to ask. I'm not very in the weeds on those personnel appointments, other than to say, I think they've tried to rotate in the other services. When you think about this tension between operational competence and political reliability, I think the theater commands are really designed with operations in mind. They talk about this as the Chinese Goldwater Nichols, which is the watershed U.S. policy that created our kind of joint force system. And so I think ultimately they really want jointness. So I don't think that will disrupt that operational goal. But it's notable how strong that Army representation is in that political leadership. And really the Navy role is not meaningful. And both the naval and the Air Force personnel on it came exclusively out of political commissar roles. And so they're really not the operational people that you'd imagine would be in these senior leadership roles. And that has some bearing on the second part of your question, which is like, are the maritime issues the predominant strategic ones? I'm of course biased I have a sort of selection bias because I've looked at these very closely and I've read everything that they've had to say about it. But it does stand out that the major strategic problems facing China generally have a dominant maritime component. Of course, Taiwan is going to be an amphibious campaign if there ever is any military action there. And as I said, the Western Pacific, or the Pacific as a whole, really is the locus of all the conceivable real, great power conflicts, certainly any major campaign. That's the way the PLA is oriented. And then the supporting, the strategic rear for that campaign is across the Indian Ocean region. And I think there isn't really any realistic prospect for China sustaining its resource needs in a protracted conflict, from pipelines from Russia or Central Asia, just for scale problems overwhelm. And so I do think that again, the locus of China's strategic problems and likely conflicts do come in that maritime domain. And then I'm not sure I entirely understood the direction of the final question, other than to say, I think it kind of dovetails with my last answer to Dr. Jacob, in that China's overseas interests have become more expansive, and therefore China's military instrument needs to accommodate that broader global scope. And so in some ways, by definition, there is a necessity of becoming more expeditionary. And you can read this in black letters off of all the developing doctrine. 2015 was the first time China published a, quote unquote, a military strategy, and they're much more explicit about this idea that there are overseas interests that need to be protected, that there's a near seas and a far seas theater, and that there are specific strategic tasks that the PLA is taking up. And this really, for people who've studied China and the PLA for longer than I have, I think there's a really transformational change in the way they talk about their role in the world. It still sits alongside this contradiction of we're against hegemony, we're not following in the path of the colonial powers or of the United States, and yet there's sort of this tail wagging the dog, or rather kind of backing into that type of posture, which I think if you were to really do your homework about most colonial enterprises, that often is the way it is, certainly in the rhetoric of any of these countries that ended up gallivanting around the globe using their military force. They certainly didn't conceive their aims as offensive, and yet there is this sort of creep that we've seen historically, and I think that there are a lot of the elements of that evident in China today.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of points by way of perspective. I think that it's useful to, when we try to think about what the projection of Chinese military power overseas may look like, it's useful to bear in mind that you have the examples of the United States and the Soviet Union for the longest time, where each country had very strong internal political economy, compulsions for expanding overseas, for seeking to occupy territory, for seeking to change regimes, influence regimes, overthrow governments, impose governments. There is little indication that the Chinese, insofar as Varun, you were saying, that they've won the battle in terms of the leader of the socialist world. The socialist world no longer exists anymore, but for the Soviet Union, the export of the Soviet model, whether it was in Angola or Ethiopia or Grenada, was fundamental. The Chinese are not, by all accounts, not interested in that. And I think that is going to play a role in defining the use of Chinese military power. I think that when they say in the work report, protecting Chinese interests abroad, that has a very specific meaning. There's a very strong defensive component, which is your SLOCs. Chinese are excessively dependent on certain maritime routes where they are weak and where they are vulnerable to sea denial. But of course, strengthening themselves, say, in the Indian Ocean region also becomes an offensive thing against India, because one of the ways in which India could retaliate to the imbalance on the Ladakh border would be to make life difficult for the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean region. And if you have PLAN beefing up its presence in this region, that limits our options. So I think that's one point I wanted to make. And secondly, I think the question of legitimacy at the end of the day, we often forget. I mean, I think regimes, the issue is, can they be in a situation where the public or the people as a whole force a government to abandon a certain course or adopt a certain course of action? And I think here, even in democracies, who can forget the demonstration of 4 or 5 million people in London urging the Blair government not to invade Iraq? And nobody who was familiar with the UK at that time would dispute the fact that that's what British public opinion represented. They did not want the UK to invade Iraq. Yet the British government went ahead. No great consequence politically was paid by that government. And the public was unable to influence. So if in democracies which are input-driven, which have input-driven legitimacy, people are not able to make their, you can have massive protests and manifestations of dissatisfaction without upsetting the apple cart. And I think that the capacity of the CPC to withstand public protests, should they ever emerge in that form, would also be quite considerable.
I think all of the exchange of ideas will be at the conference dinner, which will be after the sunset. So please join me in showing our appreciation to my co-panelists.